Just last week, I had dinner with a friend of mine who is an African-American actress. We knew each other long ago here in Toronto, but she's moved to New York City. And though we've emailed and spoken on the phone, she reminded me last week that the last time we sat down to dinner was the night before the US presidential elections. And back then, I remember her saying to me in a very careful voice, "You know, Alexa," she said, "my agent has been sending me out for roles with no mention of skin color for decades. And I always prepare. And every time I watch the television program later, I see that the role has gone to a white person." She said, "Black and whites together, we say that we want change, but I don't know if we're open to it. I don't know if we're ready, and I don't think that America is prepared to elect their first Black president." She was so disheartened, so tired of waiting. And so you can imagine how overjoyed I was the very next night as I sat watching the American elections and watching them elect their first Black president. And the very next day, I remember South Africa's first Black president, Nelson Mandela. He said Barack Obama's victory demonstrated that no person anywhere in the world should not dare to dream of wanting to change the world for a better place. And perhaps, like me, you watched Obama's victory speech, and maybe you were moved by the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who himself ran in the 1980s for the Democratic presidential nomination. Maybe you were moved by him as I was, because as Barack Obama took to that luminous stage in Chicago's Grant Park, Jesse Jackson looked on with tears streaming down his face. And I could not help but think that those flood of tears were for half a century of preparation, often done in the dim light of hope in those dark times of segregation and oppression. And they were finally being made manifest, those hopes, on the brightly lit stage in Grant Park. And I felt gratitude. I felt gratitude for those who had heard the call and taken up the torch because, well, most of us know that preparing for anything, even the smallest things in our lives, can produce a paralyzing anxiety. I asked a mentor of mine just the other day, "Do you ever stop being nervous before you preach?" And he said, "After 27 years of preaching, I can honestly answer, no." The world is preparing itself for the end of oil and the beginning of climate change. And many of us ponder fearfully, how do we prepare for a life in the midst of unpredictable weather and political patterns, where a crisis in Egypt sets off a chain reaction across the Middle East, and a tsunami in Japan devastates that country, and fears about nuclear meltdowns ripple across the globe? How do we here in this congregation prepare to live our lives in a world where God's kingdom has come and at the same time has has not yet come. In our challenging text for today, the 5 foolish bridesmaids were unprepared for the unexpected delay of the groom. And it's clear that it's that lack of preparation which kept them from the party. All of the bridesmaids fell asleep. But when the call came at midnight, only the ones without oil, who were woefully unprepared, were shut out. And this text is a terribly challenging one for many of us Christians, because we can't help but ask in wonder, is God abandoning some of us? But we know that Jesus died for every one of us. We know that time after time, God does not give up. So what is happening in this story? This parable is considered to be an allegory about the kingdom of heaven, and we know that because Jesus starts off the story by saying, "The kingdom of heaven will be like this." In Matthew's gospel, particularly in this text, we learn that there is no free pass to the kingdom. Jesus tells us so in many Matthean passages. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father." And this will does not appear to be an easy thing to do. After all, only 50% of the bridesmaids succeeded. In Matthew 24:12, Jesus says, "Because of the increased lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. The wise do not let their lamps of love go out. And the foolish must have succumbed to some kind of lawlessness, their love growing cold while they slumbered." But that brings me to another question. I wonder, how do these wise women know how to live good and lawful, loving lives? They could not have looked to their religious leaders, because the Pharisees, we are told, are like the empty oil lamps. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says that they outwardly appear righteous to men, but within are full of hypocrisy and inequity. So it's an inner life, not an outer life, an inner life of authenticity and righteousness and righteous behavior that's the key. And while we Christians will affirm that, yes, this is what is being asked of us, we know that that spirit that is willing is often battling a flesh that is weak and prone to falling asleep. After all, the disciples at Jesus' most desperate hour fell asleep 3 times.